And so it's my pleasure to introduce Scott Kurashige. Scott is a professor of American and Ethnic Studies and a senior advisor for faculty diversity at the University of Washington, Bothell. Bothell, did I get that right? And previously professor at the University of Michigan. He is the author or co-author of 4 books, including The Shifting Grounds of Race, Black and Japanese Americans in the Making of Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles, that's in 2008. The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism for the 21st Century, this was with Lee Boggs in 2011. And The 50-Year Rebellion, How the U.S. Political Crisis Began in Detroit, and that was just last year in 2017. His articles have appeared in multiple anthologies and journals, including Afro-Hispanic Review, AmeriAsia Journal, the Journal of Asian American Studies, and the Journal of American History. He worked closely with the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership, which is based in Detroit, and previously served as a senior fellow for the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, and as a fellow at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. He received his BA in History from the University of Pennsylvania, MA in Asian American Studies from UCLA, and of course, PhD in History from UCLA. And he will be in conversation with Samir for the next few minutes. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Scott, for agreeing to take part in this conversation, which I think in really important ways will help bring together threads that we've begun to hear in the first panel, but also as we progress throughout the day. And your most recent book, as Lisa mentioned, The 50-Year Rebellion, I think allows us to pull those threads together through the really important story, the history of Detroit and its communities. And so maybe I'm wondering if we can begin actually just with the very basic question of why Detroit, what it is about Detroit that you're saying is so important to understanding so many of the developments, political, economic, social developments happening in cities nationally, not just in Detroit itself.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say really thank you all for coming out here. I'm really humbled to be here. There's such a wealth of knowledge both on the stage and in the audience. Thank you, Samir, for bringing me in. Really thank you to all the staff for just making this possible. Detroit, I think, to me, is an incredible place, and it changed my life to live there for 14 years. One, because I got to work very closely with Grace Lee Boggs, but also because I got to know so many people who embodied the city's cultural history, but for me, more directly, the city's political history of activism, social movements, and struggle. And I think Detroit, in many ways, epitomized the Northern civil rights, Black Power movement in the 60s. The Detroit Rebellion obviously symbolized the crisis facing urban areas in the country as a whole. I subtitled my book, How the U.S. Political Crisis Began in Detroit, not because that's the only place where these movements or rebellions were happening, because in many ways the Detroit Rebellion was really in many ways the biggest symbol of these contradictions that were just coming together, crashing together in the mid to late 1960s. And today, 50 years or so after the 67 rebellion, I think Detroit in many ways still embodies the best and worst possibilities of where this country is moving.
Yeah, and so, to take a step back, you mentioned Grace Lee Boggs, and I know many in the room are familiar with her life and work, but just for the benefit of those that may not, do you mind sharing kind of what her importance and significance has been for so many years, and that of her husband, Jimmy Boggs, as well, and how actually also their stories in some ways reflect the evolution of that city and of the movements happening in that city.
Yeah, James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs, were this incredible couple. James was a black auto worker from rural Alabama. He rode the rails, wound up, in Detroit. He was part of the labor movement. He was part of the Black Power movement. And he is someone who went from, growing up in the Jim Crow South with almost no educational or economic opportunities to becoming a prominent voice, not just for auto workers or for Detroit's black community, but really for a sense of radical transformation of society. So he is in dialogue with some of the world's leading intellectuals. As a black auto worker writing, basically self-taught manifestos from Detroit in the 50s and 1960s. So it's an incredible story. And then for him, as a black auto worker from the rural South, to become politically and romantically connected to Grace Lee Boggs, a Chinese American, so she's the daughter of Chinese immigrants born in 1915 above her parents' Chinese restaurant in Providence, Rhode Island, grows up in New York City. Amazingly, is one of the first Chinese American women to get a PhD in philosophy of all fields in 1940, has no prospects at all for a job in academia. And so, she is working as a library assistant in Chicago, at the University of Chicago. She meets C.L.R. James as she gets involved in the March on Washington movement, in the socialist movement, in the black movement. And she spends 20 years working very closely with C.L.R. James, eventually breaks with some of his ideas and gets more connected with Jimmy Boggs, really imagining what's happening in Detroit, the center of the auto industry, the labor movement, and this promise, right, of the American dream, the rise of the middle class for generations of white workers, and only in a very, very limited way, right, for black workers. And so they begin to challenge all the inequities, but then they realize that it's not enough, that this system was not set up to make people equal, and it was not set up to be sustainable for everyone. And in fact, what we had to do was radically transform all of society.
And you in your book, you sort of lay out the first important kind of moment in this 50-year arc that you're looking at as the 1967 rebellion, as you call it, not riot, as is so often referred to as. And so can you just talk about what the significance of that, what happened in 1967 in Detroit, and what was significant about it, and how did it sort of ripple beyond just the borders of that city?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, there was a big debate in the 60s, and there's still a debate today in a lot of ways. Do you call it a riot or rebellion? Similar thing in Watts, similar thing in Newark, throughout, let's say, today in Baltimore, in Ferguson, right? How do we talk about these uprisings that are taking place? And, in the 60s, it was very important for people who were part of these political movements to see these events not necessarily as being entirely coordinated by political leadership, but as reflecting legitimate frustrations in response to structural inequality and oppression. And I think that was really important, the naming of them as rebellions as opposed to riots, which symbolized simply a breakdown of law and order and a call for policing. In fact, they were rebellions because they were against the ongoing crisis that was being caused by lack of opportunities and jobs, education, and the biggest of all, of course, was the police brutality, right? That people in cities like Detroit, particularly in the black community, saw the police as an occupying force, as an occupying army, right? And so this was, in many ways, a rebellion against oppression and domination, similar to what was happening, throughout the Third World at that time, in Vietnam, Africa, other places around the world. So I think that's the first important thing. Maybe.
Yeah. And so then you talk about really what the implications were in the aftermath of the 67 rebellion. And so what was the impact that had on that city? And also, how did that particular rebellion come to symbolize so much of the processes that were unfolding, not just there locally, but in so many cities, as you mentioned?
I think I want to point to an essay that Jimmy and Grace Boggs wrote. And they wrote it sort of in the historical space between the March on Washington, which, of course, first happened in Detroit. There was a march down Woodward Avenue in Detroit, the Walk for Freedom, that Martin Luther King helped lead, though he was called in by local civil rights leaders, including Aretha Franklin's father. Let's give a nod to the memory of the Queen. And the civil rights, I think, revolution, as it's coming to fruition with the Civil Rights Act 64, with the Voting Rights, obviously, transformative moment in history, but is also a time in which the King himself and others are talking about how these northern cities like Detroit, which already nominally had many of these rights, the right to vote, still were experienced, right, these persistent forms of inequality, structural oppression, and police brutality. And so the Boggs were trying to imagine what does it mean, not just for the civil rights to come to the North, as King did when he went to live in Chicago, where I was just last week, but how we had to imagine political transformation, self-determination, beyond what had already been expressed or formally accomplished, right? As the first panel was talking about with the civil rights achievements, and they gave this. They came up with this phrase: "The city is the black man's land," right? Because obviously you had a struggle for control of land and going back to Reconstruction and before in the South. But by this point, the Great Migration had brought so many millions of African Americans to the North that they began to imagine what would political power mean, right? And this is before Black Power had become sort of popularized by Stokely. So it's really between '63, the big marches, then the legislation, and then '65 with the Watts Rebellion, and then the rebellions after that they begin to develop this concept. And this is where we begin to see a shift in the discussion from having rights to having community control, right? That was really central to the Black Power movement. So a lot of that was around the issue of what does racial self-determination mean. The second was around the issue of economic justice. And they had pointed out that so many generations of whites had entered the middle class, had developed sort of stable lives in these cities and auto plants like Ford and GM and Chrysler, because the capitalist economy was integrating more and more workers, right? And so in some ways, this was the promise of racial integration, that you wouldn't just, have the right to drink from, the same water fountain or sit in the same parts of the bus, but you would have rights to the same economic opportunities. But this was happening, what they saw in Detroit was happening just at the moment where the economy was shifting, right? We know today that there's global outsourcing, there's automation, there's a shift towards casual workers, meaning people who are part-time, who don't have the full benefits. Obviously in academia we see this, vast majority now of the new hires are adjunct lecturers who don't have tenure and who don't have the same job security. So we're seeing this throughout the economy today, and it's very natural that people have to survive by driving Lyft and Uber and selling their labor and selling the space in their house and their cars, right, through apps. But they already picked up on it, right? Detroit, which had been the height of industry and creating opportunities, was at the forefront of actually displacing workers, making workers unnecessary to the capitalists and the corporations. And clearly, it was black workers who were feeling that first, and it was particularly young black workers, who at one time had the hope of finishing high school, or maybe even not even finishing high school, and getting lifetime employment. Now we're suddenly becoming what the Boggs were calling the outsiders, right? So they noticed that as early as the 50s and the early 60s, and what they saw again was there really was not a hope that the system itself would continue to integrate people in the same way, and so racial integration for black workers could not have the same outcome that it did for European immigrants or white workers. And I think in many ways it was those unresolvable contradictions, the opposition to racial integration in terms of housing and schools, combined with this new structural problem within the economy, that in many ways created the political crisis, right? And I think it's important to recognize that, and when I was writing this book, I started out writing it probably around 2014, something like that, trying to finish it in time for the 2017 anniversary. And I was trying to draw attention to the fact that, now we have a black president, there seems to be all this progress, people moving into new positions of leadership who are women, people of color, and yet I wanted to create this sense that, no, there are people in places like Detroit living in a state of crisis, right? That you might think the country's fine and moving, in a upwardly mobile direction for many, but that's not the case in Detroit. Don't forget about Detroit. When Hillary Clinton is president, don't forget about what's happening in Detroit while, all these, flashy things are happening, and maybe you're excited that there's whatever, the first Asian American lesbian woman being on the Supreme Court. In between the first draft of the book and the actual publication, some things changed to the political climate. Now, we know those things were always there, and that's a big part of 67, right? Those politics that, people blocking the doors to black children entering schools, or people, shooting at African Americans trying to register people to vote, or simply, engaging in other, so-called legal maneuvers to block black representation on school boards or city councils. Those politics never went away. That's really what white flight was about, right? They moved the jobs and the schools and the political base to other areas, and they reconsolidated power, right? And I think in many ways it took 50 years, right, to go from, King's dream and the dream of the movements of the 60s, to this intermediary period where you did have some limited, significant but limited level of community control for communities of color in cities, political representation, some economic advancement, though obviously not in many ways for others, to this moment where now it seems like just the basic right to have water, the basic right to have housing, the basic right to have schools, and the basic right to vote is now all in question, right? And so much, of course, the blame is being put on the failure of black mayors or black political leaders, right? And we've already pointed out how, so much of that is an attempt to mask what were the underlying structural sources of oppression. But it's really now what's happening in Detroit today is in some ways an attempt to resolve, right, that 50 years of crisis with a counter-revolution. And yet that can't be the end of the story, because we know that movements have not died, that movements have grown in strength in many ways, and that there is in many ways a lot more potential for social transformation today than there was 50 years ago too. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned this counter-revolution, and I wonder if you can talk about how it starts to unfold in the aftermath of the 67 rebellion, with all these new and interesting contradictions around the election of the first African-American mayor of Detroit, Coleman Young, but also all these other kinds of forces that end up playing out in the city. And so how are those sort of what happens then in the aftermath of 67, in many ways, as you point out, the roots of maybe this political crisis of today?
Yeah, I want to address that by reading a quote. Sorry, lost it. It's a quote that's gone around quite a bit from Walter Benjamin, who was a Jewish intellectual, part of the Frankfurt School. And he wrote this while he was on the run from the Nazis, right? So that's important to keep that as context. And it was posted the other day by my friend Dr. Amanda Armstrong Price. And the quote says, quote, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the quote-unquote emergency situation in which we live is the rule. We must arrive at a concept of history which corresponds to this. Then it will become clear that the task before us is the introduction of a real state of emergency, and our position in the struggle against fascism will thereby improve. Not the least reason that the latter has a chance is that its opponents of fascism, in the name of progress, greet it as a historical norm. The astonishment that the things we are experiencing in the 20th century, or maybe now the 21st century, are quote-unquote still possible is by no means philosophical. It is not the beginning of knowledge, so it's not the beginning of knowledge to recognize that it's still possible for these things that we thought we had put behind us to happen, unless it would be the knowledge that the conception of history on which it rests is untenable. Right? So I think that has application both to the 60s and today, right? The rebellion in Detroit and other cities, and it was a rebellion in terms of actual physical uprising, but it was also a rebellion politically and culturally in other ways too. That didn't create a state of emergency. The rebellion itself was against an ongoing state of, some people in places like Detroit would have called it fascism. Some places people in the Jim Crow South obviously would have referred to it as fascism. But a form of authoritarianism, a lack of democracy, and a lack of economic justice. What that brought to the forefront was the fact that millions of people were living in those conditions on a daily basis, right? And that politics and governance had to change to reflect that, right? it did change in some places and in some ways, and of course in other ways it didn't. This is where you had the counter-revolution, the white flight to the suburbs, the revolt against taxes. I grew up in California, and really the first thing I ever learned about politics was Proposition 13, which effectively killed the tax. I mean, people who own homes from the 1970s, since the 1970s, are basically paying the same taxes that they were in the 1970s, even though the homes are worth, 10 times more or more than that. So you've got the tax revolt, you've got the white flight, you've got the, as people talked about, all of these measures to take resources away from those most in need in cities. So you've got, again, the withdrawal from investments in public housing and towards a privatization of limited subsidies. I mean, people who want Section 8 vouchers have to wait, like, whatever it is, 15 years or something on a waiting list. It's almost impossible to get. You begin to see an attack, of course, on the unions, first in the private sector, and then now increasingly almost across the board in the public sector. You see withdrawals from public schools. Michigan has a $1 billion charter school industry. 80% of them are for-profit operators. It's one of the most dramatic escalations of the privatization. Schooling, of course, we've seen this in the universities as well. And that counter-revolution, and in many ways, it never goes away from so many police departments, right? In some of the most blue, liberal cities in the country, you have the biggest problems with discrimination and police brutality. So I think we see that happening, throughout. But it just reaches such an intense level in Detroit to the point where an emergency manager, right? Again, so we talk about this state of emergency. It never goes away, again, for people dealing with police brutality, homelessness, poverty, failing schools. But it surfaces again in 2013 in the form of an emergency manager, not just in Detroit, but in Flint and almost every city in Detroit, in Michigan, with a black majority. And what this law says, and this was passed and then repassed and enhanced by the state government in Michigan, it says that any city that's declared to be in financial distress can have literally every function of city government stripped away from its elected leaders. So it's not just the budget, it's the police, it's the fire. There's a separate law that allows school districts to be taken over by emergency managers. And one person, in the case of Detroit, it was a corporate bankruptcy attorney from Jones Day. So someone no experience in urban planning or municipal government comes in and is allowed to make every single decision, can tear up union contracts, can privatize entire city departments, and can rewrite the budget, can overturn any decision made by the city council, right? That extreme form of taking away people's basic right to representative democracy, that every single park goes up for sale, every single city property can be for sale. And this is while the private sector is foreclosing on over 100,000 homes. And then the county is increasing its foreclosure of tax homes. So one of the things that happened in Detroit was, even after the financial crisis hit and the foreclosure crisis hit and property values dropped from, in some cases, say, $85,000 for an average house in Detroit to like $8,000. They didn't adjust the tax assessments, right? And so people had to basically pay more taxes than what their house was worth, and then those went into foreclosure. So this crisis is just hitting on so many levels. Again, 100,000 people lose their water. And when you lose your water, again, you can lose your home, but you can also have child protective services come in and take your children away. Right? I mean, just on so many levels this is happening. And that this, again, this state of emergency is really reflective of the structural oppression that people have been living under that had built up to that point.
Yeah, and one of the things that you say, is that in some ways these conditions create incredible possibilities for reimagining communities in the future. And so even though you're talking about all of these incredibly huge challenges that communities in Detroit and communities like that are facing, that also there's really important ways to think about what these conditions offer in terms of rethinking the future, not just of Detroit, but of many cities and communities. And so what are some of those sort of sources of hope for thinking about how communities can use this incredibly challenging climate to re-envision?
Well, I think the first thing that's most important to recognize is the crisis of the 60s, the crisis of today. It's not that we had a perfect system and there were some people with too much money or too much, inflated sense of power that wanted to corrupt the system. The reality is the system itself had built-in structural forms of inequity, and that really it was the movements to address historical contradictions that put the system in crisis, right? That it was challenging these systems of domination and oppression that creates these moments that are seen as a crisis. If it's normal for people to be subjected to police brutality and segregation and inequality, and economic exploitation, that's the problem, right? And so, again, nobody likes living through a moment of crisis, but it puts the questions on the table in ways that now, are at least being addressed. It's understanding the history of movement building. I think that's the only way anything changes, right? Things don't change. Reforms, even slow incremental reforms, only come about because movements arise and put pressure and create power and create an alternative sense of possibilities. We're living in a moment now where the attempt to create reforms, right? I think this is what's really different today. We've always had inequality. We've always had oppression, right, in this country, particularly around, race and other key forms of social identity. The thing about American liberal democratic capitalism, whether you or I believe the ideology or not, the thing that gave it its at least purported legitimacy was the belief that things will get better over time, right? That, other places had clung to these outmoded ideologies, of extreme forms of conservatism. And other places had tried to, again, you can judge whether it was successful or not, leap forward into socialism or communism in these utopian ways. But the promise of liberalism was that we would keep our society together and that everybody would at least have an opportunity for, greater mobility and rights over time. I think we're in a moment now where even that prospect, we're not debating that prospect of whether we're going to have reform that goes a little bit faster or a little bit slower. We're now at this moment where, our basic constitutional rights are going to be respected, right? Are we going to go to a system that's more democratic and more egalitarian than we have now, right? And, again, you actually see some of these things happening. I live in the state of Washington. They just outlawed the death penalty and life without parole, juvenile life without parole, right? So there are these big leaps forward happening in some places. And yet, obviously, there are these threats, again, with climate change, with the environment, with what's happening, with the latest proposals around defining, transgender identities out of existence. There's all these ways in which just basic rights are being threatened or are already stripped away, right? So I think that's what's really different about this moment is that whole notion that there's some middle ground that we can all gravitate toward and we're sort of struggling to move a little bit more this way or that way, that's really been replaced by this significant fight over what's kind of the future. That's what I think makes Detroit more important. As Howard says, the development in Detroit hasn't reached the scale of San Francisco or Seattle, where I am now, or DC, or some of these other places. So it's not necessarily the number of buildings that have come up or how many people it affects. But when you look at the ideology and the policy and the power behind it, then you really begin to see the extremes. So again, it's true, Detroit has a lot more space than just about every big city in America. As they say, you could sort of fit San Francisco, in the empty spaces of Detroit. But that's what makes the fact that low income, particularly black folks, disabled folks, elderly folks, are being removed for new development subsidized by the government. That's what makes it even more, criminal, right, that's happening. And again, like I said, the policies are just so extreme that Howard alluded to this new development, and almost more than half, maybe even way more than half of the new developments in downtown Detroit are under the control of one man, Dan Gilbert, right? Who owns the Cleveland Cavaliers, and that's enough reason to dislike him. But he has bought over 100 buildings in downtown Detroit, and he came in, after the crash of 2008, 2009. So much of this is being heavily subsidized. There's another big developer, Mike Ilitch, and now it's his family since he passed away. In the middle of the bankruptcy of Detroit, they got $300 million approximately to build a new hockey arena in public subsidies. But what's happening now is not only do these billionaire developers, not only do they get the subsidies, they get on top of the subsidies, they get to basically collect income tax, property tax, and sales tax from the people within their developments. It goes directly into their pockets. Right? It's not like the state collects taxes, the government collects taxes, and then these developers lobby to get funds. They are now building into law that they get those directly. And Detroit's Amazon proposal, which didn't even make the first cut, right, from Michigan, state of Michigan, city of Detroit, would have given Amazon those same rights to simply take and recapture, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues directly into the pockets of the developers and the corporations. So again, that's the downside. The upside, though, is that Detroit has this incredible movement history, right? With, the great migration of black folks to the north. You have black churches, you have Motown, you have communities that were fighting for civil rights and black power. You have, in the aftermath of the auto industry layoffs, you have people creating alternative forms of economic survival. A lot of people have recognized, the vacant lots in Detroit being turned into urban farms. Not that it's going to become this huge industry that feeds everyone, but it's a symbol of people taking culture and technology from the past, organic farming, particularly since so many black elders grew up in the South during sharecropping, and merging it with, with 21st century technology like digital fabrication, or what they call 3D printing, where people can actually, instead of fighting for the wealth they create for GM or Chrysler or Ford, actually would just own the means of production and the means of self-sufficiency. How do we merge that with a fight over, again, not just desegregating housing, but creating community land trusts where we have actually taken the profit motive out of housing and made housing what it's supposed to be, a right, first of all, but something that's made for simply people to live in and build community around. That the school fight, which again, the courts prohibited cross-district busing, right? So as Detroit was trying to segregate, even if you get these rulings in the aftermath of Brown, it began to become irrelevant after whites basically left the Detroit school system entirely, and then the courts outlawed cross-district busing. So you couldn't integrate the city and suburbs together. So, combine that with the attempts to bankrupt the public school system, and now you have people, again, fighting not just to create more equal schools, but to redefine education. So that for so many generations, Detroit high schools were the place where very, very small people go to college, and, some of us have worked at the University of Michigan. Almost nobody from the city of Detroit, particularly blacks in Detroit, ever get to the University of Michigan. And so it was a place where the vast majority were trained to basically get jobs in the big three auto industry. But that's such a now, anachronistic model of education. It never was a fully, human growth form of education in the first place, and now people are redefining education based on, the ideas that people are familiar with, people like Paulo Freire, that are like, how does education serve communities? How is it about building collective power and knowledge as opposed to individual upward mobility, and people simply leaving the city, right, to go somewhere else. With the water crisis, people began to come together. How do we create cooperatives amongst neighbors, and between multiple families and communities. Similar thing has happened with the foreclosure crisis. You have anti-eviction cooperatives that have basically sprung up to save people from being thrown out of their houses. There's all kinds of tactics that people use. The important thing here is people are not just protesting. Of course people are protesting. They're petitioning. They're trying to vote, in people with better values. But they are creating, not just creating and envisioning alternatives, but they're modeling alternatives. And Amanda's going to talk about the amazing thing that the Detroit Just Center is doing to talk about restorative justice. And again, not just to protest the mass incarceration crisis, but to create alternatives that not just work on a policy level, but create communities that are more cohesive, that are more cooperative, that are more about taking care of each other when it's so clear that the folks in power have abandoned them.
Yeah. So I want to begin to open up the conversation, including those of you in the overflow spaces, but also you all in this room, and maybe just use one question as a segue, so that you all can be thinking about your questions. I'm just wondering, you had the opportunity to work with Grace Lee Boggs for the last couple of decades of her life, and I'm curious, as she, as someone who had lived in Detroit and worked with movements in Detroit over decades, kind of what insights she had towards the end of her life about what was happening in Detroit and therefore also nationally and beyond in terms of the political developments in cities.
I think she was, a product of cities. She grew up in New York City. Ironically, her father was very successful. He didn't just own a Chinese restaurant like in Chinatown. He actually owned a Chinese restaurant on Broadway. It's like if you read Henry Miller, he actually writes about how Chin Lee's was one of his favorite restaurants. Where if you actually watch the film Henry and June, Uma Thurman actually talks about eating at Chin Lee's with Henry Miller. But he had to buy his first home in Jackson Heights in the name of his white contractor, right? So imagine that, that at one time the Lee family, was trying to break in as a non-white, as a Chinese American family, into an all-white Jackson Heights today is, about as diverse a community as you can find. So I think she saw cities as a site, certainly of demographic change, but she saw with cities becoming majority black, majority non-white, immigrant, that they would bring a new dynamism, that there was a new prospect to redefine community, that certainly there was a basis for political power, right? Obviously that was exciting to some and threatening to others. So I think that was important. I think obviously her marriage to James Boggs, which seemed, in some ways to be an oddity in the 20th century, and again, she is one of the most learned, intelligent, people you could ever meet, and her writing was prolific, and she worked with some of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century. I mentioned C.L.R. James being just one of them. She, she had exchanges with Nkrumah. She had exchanges with Eric Williams, George Padmore. I mean, she really was this incredible site of intellectual and political creation, yet never had a single, position of any kind in the university system, right? So people that were marginal and on the outskirts of 20th century U.S. society are in many ways defining what it is to be an American for so many people in the 21st century. Did anyone see this movie that HBO made about Barack Obama when he was a college student? It was called Barry. If you actually watch this film, it has this really incredible ending, and close your ears for a second if you don't like spoilers. He's a college student at Columbia. He's, of course, half black, half white. He's going to a majority white Ivy League school while playing basketball, and going to the barber shop, in Harlem, trying to figure out where he fits in. And he's got this white girlfriend who's a composite, apparently, of people he dated. And he's confused. He's feeling, paralyzed by this confusion and not fitting in, right? Because apparently, America is so divided that he doesn't belong in either space. And you know how he resolves this identity crisis, which is, again, paralyzed him from being a political actor, right, which we know he will become. He gets introduced to James and Grace Lee Boggs at the end of the film, and they tell him, no, actually, you are America, and you are the future of America. It's not a true story, just so you know. Talk to the Boggs family and the Obama family about this, and I know it's not true. But it shows how, again, people who are so, seen as outsiders to 20th century America, and in many ways, not for everyone, but for at least, the former president who wrote a nice tribute to Grace when she passed away, have become the symbols and the role models of a new sense of American promise in a very different way in the 21st century. So I think, in many ways, she wouldn't want us to focus on her as an individual, although many do. It's really, what did the work and the ideas and now the legacy of Grace and James, what does that represent to us today? When she would want us to see, look, places like Detroit, which look like they're places of blight, and violence and crime. Detroit was the only city, other than Washington, D.C., but that was metaphoric, mentioned in the inaugural speech of the current president in 2017. He didn't mention Chicago in that one. Chicago came later on. When they're seen by so many, as places of despair and destruction and cast up, how can we actually gain the greatest sense of hope and promise from the people who have not only survived, but so they can teach us about resilience, but are teaching us about possibility and creative imagination and liberation?
Yeah, so I'd really like to begin opening up the conversation. Please, is there a mic available? There should be. Mic is coming, just so we can get it on and everyone can hear, including in the overflow spaces.
First off, mad props for mentioning Walter Benjamin in a conversation. I think anytime Frankfurt School is mentioned anywhere, it's a good thing. One of the interesting points you made earlier on sort of strikes me similar to something that people talk about on the national stage, which is the state of exception, which is subverting the rule of law and sort of consolidating power in an emergency situation, you could say terrorism or war, so that the executive branch or one of the branches of government have more power and function in sort of a non-democratic sort of way. And it strikes me as what you're saying is that in cities the same thing is happening, where you have emergencies, crises that arise, and that allows for consolidation of power and circumventing the normal rule of law, the normal way that things function. What's happening to Detroit to counter that? And can you talk a little bit more about these emergency situations and how they work to sort of consolidate power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, the first point was that what's an emergency situation for some is the normal state of, oppression and structural inequality for others. So that's the first thing. But I think you do see these moments where there's an attempt to define an emergency in ways that that normalize, as you're talking, normalize even more, anti-democratic measures and policies. So obviously, so the first thing people did in the state of Michigan even was they did a voter initiative to overturn the emergency manager law, right? And first the opponents of that said, oh no, that's not the right size font, so your petitions are invalid. I mean, this is the level at which, right, this is going. They finally won that battle, right? Because it wasn't the font size, it was the type size or something. They won it on some bizarre technicality. And then this measure won, which means that the emergency manager law was invalidated. And then in the lame duck session right after that, the majority, which was GOP at that time and still is, and a lot of that is based on gerrymandering. I mean, Michigan, again, nominally, again, people have contested whether all the ballots were counted properly, but nominally, went to Trump. But the Republicans still held like a 27-11 majority in the Senate, right? So it's just state Senate. So there's this massive imbalance. And so they were able to just simply pass another version of the emergency manager law. And they added like $5,000 for people to, print pamphlets to educate people about what the law was, post notices about it. And that meant it was an appropriation, which meant it could not be subjected to another voter referendum, right? So there's just incredibly, nefarious but sophisticated ways in which even the attempt by people to vote things, a different way has been repelled. And obviously the gerrymandering is a big part. Michigan has a ballot now to have sort of an independent commission, deal with districting. So we'll see if that passes. So I mean, that's happening at the policy level. Obviously there are different candidates running for, offices. But I think, the dynamism is really seen at the grassroots level, right? So urban farming is when it's not just, nice people coming together and planting gardens. It really is tied to intergenerational connection between elders and youth. It's tied to people feeling more empowered to take their neighborhoods back from, years of problems with crack houses, or violence in other forms. And it's connected to people challenging violence in ways that are not about promoting the carceral state, right? Not calling the police, but promoting de-escalation, right? So if you look at the work of the Detroit Committee Against Police Brutality, and there's a wonderful pamphlet about this written by a late friend of mine named Ron Scott, it's really about de-escalation. It's how do you build community forms of empowerment so that people don't have to call the police? Because what they found is most of these acts of police violence, police killing, were in response to domestic calls, right? And so how do we create a different sense of community, of masculinity, of justice, and of empowerment so that doesn't happen in the first place? Again, so it's about an economic form of self-reliance. It's about a form of political self-governance. It's about, again, linking that to education and culture in the arts, different ways. If you look at the work of the Allied Media Projects, they're combining things like access to the internet with ways for people at the grassroots to tell different stories about themselves in the city of Detroit, combining that with activist workshops and training, combining that with public art. They do a conference every year except next year called the Allied Media Conference, which just brings together incredibly creative artists, activists, media makers from around the country and seeing Detroit as that different place of possibility. So there's a lot of different examples, but those are just a few to get started.
Yes, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have the mic already.
Sorry.
I'll give it right back. One thought in response to that question was just that it was striking how vividly Trump was able to employ the fear-mongering around his dystopian views of urbanism in order to seize control and for the GOP to bounce on that. And I think probably similar ways to how Nixon did it in 1968. But my question is regarding, my name is Jonathan, I'm from Chicago, is regarding, you mentioned some forms of cooperative like housing and community land trust. What role do you think cooperative economics and like co-ops in neighborhoods can play potentially? Do you think it's a legitimate possibility in terms of wealth building, and what kind of policy do you know that can help increase that if it is indeed a positive way forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the groups I would highlight is the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. They, on land they lease from the city on the west side, have a very large farm now called the D-Town Farm. These are people that come out of the Black Power movement. They're connected to the folks that are in Jackson, Mississippi, around Chokwe Lumumba, and now Chokwe Antar Lumumba, the current mayor, who've talked about cooperative economics as the key to Black community empowerment. And so they have the urban farm, they've got educational programs, cultural programs. They are now starting a food co-op, a market. And that's going to hopefully challenge the Whole Foods, which was highly subsidized and spread out. So I think that's the one thing, to challenge that, there's millions and hundreds of millions of dollars going into subsidies, just like Howard talked about in Camden, for these developments in Detroit. And, you know, those need to be redirected towards community-based, right, cooperative forms of economic development. So again, the market is one, the farms are the, so they're trying to create these connections, right? So it's not just growing, it's distributing food, it's creating jobs. And then there's been a push to have a food justice policy. It's already passed the city council, but it's never been fully implemented. And so you could just imagine, right, if the schools started using, you know, and Alice Waters started this in Berkeley, right? If the schools started using organically grown produce, hopefully from local producers, but at minimum, you know, from local businesses, that could have an impact. I mean, there's just been this incredible crisis of the food provided to the prisons in Michigan too. So, you know, you can go from bad, unhealthy food to not just better food that tastes better and is better nutritiously, but is also more stimulative of local economic ownership and cooperative development. And of course, that would be a source of education for children at a time when, you know, a small number of corporations are basically trying to dominate the whole global food supply, and climate change is only going to increase the crisis that peasants and small producers and communities are facing around the world. So those are just examples. I know there are other questions people have. So.
Yes.
Hey, how you doing, Scott?
Over here.
I wonder if you might share with us your understanding of the crisis of Detroit in relationship to the crises of New York City in the 1970s and the restructuring undergone there, to Chile in 1973, and how, whether or not, the ways in which it's useful and perhaps not useful to think about the crises and opportunities currently existing in Detroit in relationship to these historical crises and opportunities created by what's a historical trend of economic restructuring in particular cities.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I think the first important thing, and you know, Thomas Segru, the historian, wrote a good book about this, right? The crisis in Detroit wasn't caused by the rebellion, right? The rebellion was a symptom of the crisis. It was actually people mobilizing in response to the crisis. I think the other thing, the reason why so much of the counter-revolution, this attempt, again, to defund the schools and target the unions and take away people's representative government and their water, it's because, you know, what's unique about Detroit, it's happening in a lot of cities, right? But it's so concentrated in Detroit because the Black Power movement achieved a high, you know, level of representation. It didn't achieve all the goals it set out to, but it did create black political power in a way almost like, you know, nowhere else. There are certainly parallels, but again, Detroit was a place where the power of the labor movement and the black movement really came together in some really profound ways. And so I think that's another thing that's a part of it. On the other hand, these models that they're creating to try to, again, you know, defund the pensions, you know, privatize city government, those now are being exported throughout the world. So it's just amazing as I was researching this book to see that, first of all, the people that were the architects of this bankruptcy. So they had this corporate bankruptcy attorney, you know, and he's African American. They literally said, we have to have a black man be the face of this. But there were probably like a dozen really, really prominent, almost all white, most of them University of Michigan Law School graduates, who designed this, came together, and these are people that came from Wall Street in many ways. They work for financial consulting firms, and some of them own their own investment firms. They're now going around the world selling this as a new growth opportunity, you know, for Wall Street, right? Literally, the financial architect of the Detroit bankruptcy, a guy named Kenneth Buckfire, who's known as like one of the Wall Street turnaround experts, he went straight to Puerto Rico and Greece, you know, again, working for himself and for these other Wall Street firms seeking to, you know, profit off of the crisis there. Even the bankruptcy judge, the federal judge who retired after he did the Detroit bankruptcy, he worked for one of these Wall Street firms to consult on the Puerto Rican bankruptcy and debt crisis. And then the treasurer who appointed a lot of these people He was like the one Democrat in the, he was like the one moderate Democrat in the Republican administration. He had to resign from the Treasury position because some things came out about his history of domestic violence. He goes back to working for one of these financial firms, consulting firms. He then starts working on the Puerto Rican debt crisis. So there's this real model that's just been created to, privatize government, give all the benefits to these Wall Street bankers around the world. And my goodness, God knows what's going to happen in Brazil. Yeah, right. We really do have this global, counter movement, right, against basic forms of, liberal democracy and governance, and yet that is in many ways in Brazil as a response to the movements that people have created, right, that have raised expectations and promises, that were obviously seen as threats to those who were, had the money and the power.
So I've gotten the time cutoff signal. So unfortunately, we have to end this conversation, or this part of the conversation. But please join me in thanking Scott for this great conversation.